Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. My name is Aaron, and I'm here to defend capitalism and criticize socialism. Today, I want to talk about property rights. Specifically, there's two kinds of property rights. There's public property and there's private property. Now, public property is a universal kind of ownership. Everyone owns it, no one is excluded from ownership. It's automatic, it's axiomatic, it applies universally in terms of owning a kind of property. Everyone owns it. Private property is exclusionary, it's not universal. One or more people can own private property, but it's not automatic. You have to opt in some way, and it's not universal. Now, these two kinds of property, they're basically binary. They're in either or. It's a correct dichotomy. You can't have like a half and half. Either property is universally owned or it's exclusionary in its ownership. It's one or the other. Now, socialists will often talk about property, specifically like the means of production, companies having to be publicly owned. Now, the type of socialists that advocate this kind of public ownership are the authoritarian socialists. They want everyone to own all the companies universally. Generally, but not always, they advocate the execution of this through the mechanism of a government or a centrally planned state that's going to enforce the public ownership. Now, the thing about public property in a universal sense is that it is a form of absentee landlordism. And absentee landlordism is when you own something that you don't work at or live in, something that you don't directly mix your labor with, but you're reaping the benefits of ownership of it. Now, absentee landlordism, the reason why this is important is because socialists of all stripes very strongly condemn absentee landlordism in a capitalist context. They say that if you own a house that you don't live in and you collect rent from it, or you own a company that you don't work at and you collect profits from it, that's absentee landlordism and that's exploitation and it's evil and it's wrong and it should be abolished. Well, public property is a guaranteed and mandated absentee landlordism. If you own every company, all 10,000 companies in your country, but you only work at one of them, well, you're an absentee landlord of 9,999 companies. So the fact of the matter is that socialism, when it advocates for public property, falls into the trap of absentee landlordism. It becomes guilty of the thing that it condemns. It can't escape this fact. Now, some socialists, in particular market socialists or libertarian socialists, the one that don't advocate for an authoritarian state, they'll say, well, we don't want public ownership. What we want is communal ownership. And what they generally mean by that is that they want the means of production, the companies, the factories, and so on, to be owned exclusively by the workers that work in them. So if there's one company with 10 workers, all 10 of those workers are owners of that company and no one else is allowed to own it. So it's not publicly owned. They call it collectively owned or communally owned. Well, guess what? That is exclusionary. It's non-universal. It's opt-in, and therefore it is just a form of private property. Now, socialists will try and, belabor the point, but the fact of the matter, they'll argue the point rather. But the fact of the matter is that there's just two kinds of ownership of property. There's public or there's private. It's one or the other. Now, when they say collective ownership and they distinguish that from public ownership, what they're really doing is they're putting collective ownership in the private category. If they say collective ownership is public ownership, well, then they're falling into the absentee landlordism problem that they criticize capitalism for. So now I want to focus a little bit more again on that collective ownership concept. Now, when you have collective ownership, it's going to be collective ownership rather of the means of production when the 10 workers have to own the company that they work at and no one else is allowed to own it. Well, what it is a form of private property that's mandatory, right? Now, what the reason that the socialist tries to do this and tries to mandate this kind of private property ownership, this worker co-op model, is because they're trying to stop wage labor from happening, which is they're trying trying to stop workers from working and putting their labor into an enterprise that they don't directly own. When a worker just collects a paycheck and doesn't have an ownership stake in a company, that's called wage labor, right? And socialists are opposed to that. They criticize that when capitalism does it. So here's the problem where the worker co-op, the communally owned yet also privately owned worker co-op, can fall into that trap and become guilty of the thing that the capitalists are being criticized for doing. So let's say you've got a worker co-op and there's 10 employees and they make widgets. One day the sink clogs, and then what are they going to do? They hire a plumber. They're going to pay a plumber a flat rate or an hourly rate or whatever to fix the sink. The plumber doesn't get to own the company he's working at, the sink that he repairs, right? Or let's say that you've got this company and you one day you want to expand the company's property size. Maybe you're going to expand it for additional production capacity. So what you're going to do is develop another building, another factory structure on the property. So what do? You hire some contractors, and then over the course of 6 months or a year, they build that piece. But those contractors don't become owners of that company. See, what they are essentially is wage laborers. They're getting paid an hourly rate or a flat rate or whatever it is to do this one-time project on a limited time frame, and then that's it, and they go their merry way. And what happens is you're going to compensate them monetarily or with some other resources, but you're not going to give them ownership of the company. You just paid them to make the building for you. That's it. Now, what'll happen is that means that the socialist co-op is going to have to do the thing that it criticizes capitalism for. They're going to have to become guilty of the very thing that they tried to prohibit or ban. Now, one objection I've heard a lot from socialists about this is that, hey, the plumber doesn't have to own the company that he fixes the sink at. The plumber owns his own plumbing company, and then he just goes and makes out calls to various places. It's like a independent contractor kind of thing. So what they're doing is they're excusing outsourcing. They're excusing independent contractors. Well, why is the plumber exempt, but someone who pushes the widget making button on the widget machine unable to get that same exemption? What if a company just wants to make a particular run of widgets for a particular customer, but it's only going to be that one run of that particular kind of widget, and they hire some guy who knows how to make that particular kind of widget. He does the run of 1,000 widgets. It takes him a week or two or whatever, and he gets paid a wage. He doesn't get to get an ownership share. They just compensate him in some other way, some finite way, whether it's hourly or a fixed flat rate or whatever, and then he goes on his merry way. That's wage labor too. That's independent contractor. He can be his own widget button pushing company, just like the plumber is his own plumbing company. And before you know it, you've got this system where you've got all these excuses or exemptions put in place where all these people can do all these one-time jobs or wage labor hourly rate kind of jobs for the co-ops. So it can quickly snowball or roll down the hill to the point where you've got wage labor happening all over the place. So some socialists recognize this problem, and what they do is they're the ones that advocate for a big centralized government that's going to prevent all that from happening, where everyone works for the government directly, and the plumber just gets assigned to work to go fix one sink one day, and then gets assigned to fix another sink the next day. So what that means is that then the socialists, when you opt for that centralized model to escape the wage labor problem, well, then you run into the absentee landlordism problem, where the plumber owns every company, whether he works at it or not. So either way, whether you go for the authoritarian socialism or whether you go for the worker co-op, decentralized model, you're either going to run into the problem of doing a capitalist style absentee landlordism, or you're going to run into the problem where you're going to have wage labor, and people will work and put their labor into certain entities and industries or certain enterprises that they don't own, that they don't get an ownership stake in. So there's another problem with the worker co-op model. If it's decentralized and all these workers individually own their separate little co-ops, the question is how do you know that wage labor is not happening? How do you enforce that without a centralized government, some kind of ministry of property rights ownership that runs around and investigates and inspects all the companies, all the co-ops, and makes sure that everyone has an ownership stake? How are you even going to know if socialism is being being followed? How are you even going to know that you abolish capitalism? How are you even going to know whether or not wage labor is happening? You're going to have some sort of publicly financed and centrally, controlled investigative body that's going to run around and enforce the mandate and make sure that the prohibition on wage labor is being complied with. So there's going to be some level of authoritarianism. There's going to be some level of centralization. You're not going to be able to have this totally decentralized, stateless, socialist utopia. It's not going to happen. You'll never even know if you're doing socialism at that point. Now, on the other hand, if you go big on the authoritarianism model and you embrace the centralized government kind of thing as a means to enforce the socialist economic system that you're trying to achieve, what you're going to have is a big issue with enforcement and black market activity. Because, see, the fact of the matter is that sometimes it's better for workers to own the means of production, and capitalism doesn't even forbid that. So it's optional in capitalism. But when you try and make it mandatory, and you try and ban the wage labor, or the giving someone money or resources as opposed to giving them ownership for a defined amount of labor that they're going to perform, not every worker is going to want to do that all the time. Not every worker is going to want to own everything all the time. Okay, some workers are going to try to trade some of their labor for a wage or for a flat rate or for some other resource. You're going to have bribery happening. In socialism, it's called corruption. In capitalism, they call it trade, right? So you're going to have this corruption, you're going to have this bribery kind of thing going on, and you're going to have labor getting misallocated. And by misallocated, I mean there's going to be workers that are going to illegally offer their labor in exchange for money or goods or something like that. So that's why black markets run more rampant and become larger as a percentage of total economic activity. The more you try and centrally plan an economy, the more you try to suppress the free market, the more you try and suppress wage labor. When you don't let workers voluntarily choose to make those kind of decisions and make those kind of transactions, they're going to struggle against your enforcement mechanism. And your enforcement mechanism is not going to win every war. It's not going to win every battle. Sure, you're going to be able to stop a lot of the wage labor activity, but you're not going to be able to stop all of it. And the harder you try and stop it, the bigger your prison population gets, the more economic activity you're going to suppress, and the lower output your economy has as a whole. And the less output your economy has as a whole, the more poverty you're going to have, and the less prosperity you're going to have. Now, you see this happen historically. Just to give you two examples, the USSR had a huge black market. Some people say, well, the USSR wasn't really socialist. Well, I'll tell you what, it was socialist to the degree that it made a black market for wage labor. Every worker in the USSR that illegally worked for a wage or some other resource exchange when they didn't own the means of production that they were doing the work for, and it wasn't authorized, well, that was an example of socialism being enforced upon them and then them defying it, right? So the USSR had a huge black market, and Cuba's black market today is bigger than their official economy. In fact, most Cubans get most of their food and most of the things they want, like their cell phones and computers and shit like that, through the black market. All right, that's how bad it gets. The black market is enormous in Cuba. So what'll happen is the more you try and centrally plan and centrally control, the more the economy is going to slip through your fingers and do its own thing, and you're not going to have that control. You're going to suppress it. You're going to hurt the economy. You're going to hurt productive output, but you're not going to stop the wage labor. You're not going to stop the capitalism. You're not going to stop the private property completely, because you're not going to win all of those battles. So what makes more sense in terms of maximizing good and maximizing prosperity and maximizing opportunity for every worker is to allow unfettered property rights. That means private property, worker co-ops, or public property if some people want to, if people want to do that for certain things. So you're going to get better results if you let the workers make their own choices and choose whether or not they want to own the means of production they work at, or whether or not they would rather just get, prepaid up front in a wage or some other compensation. organization that they deem is best for them. You don't know better than them. They know better than you when it comes to the decisions they make for themselves, and they should be allowed to autonomously, on an individual level, choose how their labor is going to be traded and who they're going to trade it with and what price they're going to set. And they're going to make those decisions, and it's going to result in a greater amount of prosperity for the greatest possible number of people. So when it comes to property rights, capitalism beats socialism hands down on every facet at every angle.